Welcome back. Joining us today is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a highly decorated combat veteran and also former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. So, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, Glenn.
So, we seem to be reaching now the end game in Ukraine, and the big question is, will it be finished by diplomacy or will it be finished off on the battlefield? And in terms of diplomacy, it doesn't look as if things are going very well. We have Merz, Starmer, and Macron, who reportedly advised Zelensky to reject Trump's peace agreement, and which will have consequences, I guess, both for Ukraine as well as the Europeans. So we now see that Zelensky still wants NATO, he wants the security guarantees, and he will not cede any territory. So what will happen now?
Well, I think a lot of things are ending besides the war in Ukraine. I think NATO is reaching its sell point, sell due date, whatever you want to call it. I think the European Union is crumbling. I think the governments in Berlin, Paris, and London are extremely fragile. Their approval ratings are down in, some people say, the high teens. Others say, around 30% or less. And as far as the battlefield is concerned, at least the reports that I'm being exposed to say that you have large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers now who are people that have been at most a week in uniform. They've had virtually no training and have been sent forward ostensibly to be killed. Then others are now disguising themselves as women in order to find their way through the lines. The Russians are treating them as humanely as possible because they're simply shaking their heads in disbelief that this sort of nonsense is continuing. I think the Russians are also moving some forces over the river that are now in and around Odessa. I was told yesterday that Russian special operations forces roam freely during the night around Odessa and in Kiev, because you have these long periods where you have no illumination, no lighting, no energy for it. And so they can put on their night vision devices and wander around without interference. I think this whole thing is coming to a very tragic but predictable end. And I think the Russians are concerned now with what happens as this thing crumbles. Now, they can't force the Europeans to do much. But I think the Europeans are foolish to believe that there's anything they can do to influence the outcome other than be willing to sit down and talk to the Russians. The most interesting aspect of this whole thing is now this new national security document that's come out, which has no strategy per se. It's simply a set of assertions. And the assertion that is most troubling to the Europeans is the recognition that we're not going to stay in Europe in perpetuity. We're not going to maintain our forces there in perpetuity. We're going to leave. And the question is, how do you do it? How fast does this happen? And naturally, what the Europeans don't realize is that while inevitably there is a critical need to reduce the American defense spending habit, the Congress on the Hill wants to add more money to defense because they line their pockets as a result. Their donors profit. Some of their constituents retain jobs. So it's a strange set of circumstances. And I don't see any real direction other than we're going to pull in our forces from Europe initially. And then eventually I think we'll see the same thing happen in Korea and Japan. We can't afford anything. We're financially ruined. We're broke. Nothing is improving. I was shown a statistic yesterday that said that in the last 22 months, 30% of all the dollars that have ever existed were printed. Let's stop and consider that. That is an enormous sum of money. I don't know how many trillions it amounts to, but to stop and think that 22 months, that short period, we printed 30% of all the dollars that have ever existed, tells you we're in a lot of trouble. Now, we haven't had the complete collapse here yet, but I think it's coming.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this new national security strategy because it's very hard to sometimes, predict what Trump's going to do. He tends to go a lot of back and forth in terms of how he wants to end the Ukraine war as well. But with this new security strategy, it seems like we have something concrete on paper. So in terms of how Trump wants to approach this, but what does this new security strategy tell you about how the US will deal likely with the Ukraine war? I mean, it does deal with it directly, but I guess the wider ideas put forth in this document.
I don't think there's a great deal that President Trump can do. I don't think there ever was. This was one of the criticisms I had with the dithering over the last 12 months. In fact, before he was elected, I was suggesting strongly that once he was elected to the presidency and was inaugurated, that he should begin the process of disengaging. There's not much that can be done at this point. The opportunity for Washington leading NATO in a different direction was lost back in 2022 when the first opportunity came in the form of an agreement reached in Turkey, in Istanbul. That was rejected out of hand. Subsequent discussions were all meaningless because everyone was convinced that Russia, given enough time, would fall apart, that Russia was weak, the government would not stand, that Putin was the evil dictator that under these circumstances would be willingly removed by his population. Well, it's all nonsense. But we stuck with this mantra, and even after Trump began to sober up in the run up to his election, once he was in office, he began repeating all the lies that had become standard in NATO and across the West that were prevalent in the media. The outrageous claims of heavy Russian casualties when the Russians were taking casualties, but they weren't the heavy ones. The heavy casualties were being taken by the Ukrainians. I mean, you just had a debate and touched on some of these subjects with this British, I guess he was an admiral. I don't remember. Was he an admiral or a general? People are still living in fantasy world here in the United States and in Western Europe. The average American knows that things aren't going well economically. But, it's, a sledgehammer is coming at you, but until it finally hits you over the head, you don't really understand what it means. I think that's kind of where we are with everything right now in the West. We're in a funk, as they say, a twilight zone between reality and fantasy. Reality is coming. You can see it. It's like looking at a train that's coming down the tracks, a locomotive. It's headed for you. But until it arrives at the station, you're suspicious. You're skeptical. No, it's not really coming, but it is. So I don't think this is a strategy document. There is no strategy. Strategy means that there's a coherent framework. There are guideposts. Sometimes you can call them guide rails. In other words, these are the areas where we're going to focus. This is what's strategically vital and important to the United States. This is where we're going to remain committed, engaged, and so forth. What we have is this vague notion. Well, we're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere, where we want to be dominant. Okay, well, we are already dominant in the Western Hemisphere, but apparently somebody's decided we need to invade Venezuela to demonstrate just how dominant we are, which I think is a very dumb idea, but that's prevalent in Washington. We have to signal to everyone that this is our hemisphere, we're in charge. And then you say to them, well, have you talked to Moscow and Beijing? Well, what do you mean? I said, well, they seem to think they're dominant in Asia and dominant in Eurasia and Europe. Have you talked to them about their interests? No. Where everything is done in isolation here in Washington from what happens anywhere else. We're not really taking those things into consideration. The only good part of this is Trump's personal input. Now, what is Donald Trump's personal input? First of all, it's we're not paying for NATO anymore. He's been against that for years. So NATO is going to be on its own. That's fine. Thank you. Now, how are we going to do that? That's absent. There's no discussion of how you move through some sort of process to Europeanize NATO. Well, it's probably irrelevant because I don't think Europe is going to retain NATO. There was a point in time in the 90s when you could have had a Europeanization. But now Europe is fiercely divided. It was always difficult to move as one. Moving Europeans collectively in a direction, sort of like herding cats, it's not going to happen. So you're going to end up with new security arrangements across the continent. Russia is going to play a role in that, whether we like it or not. So what's the long-term strategic focus and forecast other than we want to be dominant in the Western Hemisphere? We're no longer apparently preparing for war against China, at least not based upon what I read. And we no longer really want to go to war with Russia, based upon the sort of assertions that I read in the document. That's not a strategy, Glenn. That's just an expression of preferences.
Yeah, that's a good point. But uh, one thing which with the security strategy, which is confusing though, is well, Trump goes very heavily after the European leaders, as you mentioned, but also blaming them for refusing to end the Ukraine war, which is also reasonable. They have become the main spoilers. That being said, if Trump really wanted to end this proxy war, he would have a lot of tools, as you suggested. He has, the U.S. has all the intelligence in Ukraine. They're selling the weapons. They're even giving weapons. They do the military planning. So to a large extent, this is still Trump's war. I understand that he still wants to hold some U.S. Presence and engagement, so Ukraine doesn't simply fall apart. But there's some basis to negotiate. But that being said, he has a lot of possibility, though, to pressure both Zelensky as well as the Europeans. How do you make sense of this, given that, well, the war kind of continues, he's just shifting the blame? Is this just narratives, or how do you make sense of this?
Well, I'm having trouble making sense of the document because, again, I know President Trump and I'm familiar with his personal views and what he would like to see happen. That's fine. But that's not a strategy. The strategy is if you're going to disengage from the Ukraine debacle, how do you do it? And he's always taken the position, I think, in his mind, that he's at the center of the universe, that he is the leader of the greatest, most powerful force on earth. Okay, sounds good. It's not true, but that's what people believe. So what do? Do you summon all of the European vassal state leaders to the White House? They all sit around in front of you and wait for you to express your views, and then they try to lobby you for whatever it is that they want. That's not really how you do business. If you want to put forward an idea, you have to have a strategic framework. That's why I see none at all. Uh, how do we end up disengaging from Ukraine and simultaneously preparing to invade Venezuela? I mean, somebody said, well, we've been trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela now for at least 20 years. Some people would argue longer. All right. It hasn't worked. Why are we now building a military force for the purpose of making this happen? Well, that's not really what we want to do. Well, if that's not what you want to do, what are you doing? Are you trying to extract concessions? Are you trying to push the Chinese and Russian investments out of the country? And what are you offering if that is done? I mean, well, what is the plan? Glenn, I don't see any plan. I don't see any strategy. And I think the Europeans have a right to be frustrated by that. But keep in mind that they haven't been helpful. Just as they have taken the position that you have to fight to the last Ukrainian, defend every inch of ground, return everything to Ukraine. They pretended this Ukraine construct was always something much more than it was. Ukraine's never been a nation state. This was just a construct created by Lenin to satisfy the needs of the Soviet state system, which he devised to enhance Bolshevik control and influence. Now, it doesn't mean there were no Ukrainians. It doesn't mean there aren't Ukrainians. But the point is, nobody has sat down and looked at this thing objectively and said, well, how do we sort this child? How do we come out of this? How do we avoid future conflict? It's as though everyone wants perpetual conflict. And I think you can make an argument for that. The ruling globalist class in Europe wants conflict against Russia. Now Trump has said he doesn't. But at the same time, he's got a Congress that is bought and paid for by other interests. I mean, sometimes when I look at the Senate, I think there are African warlords that have a greater sense of obligation and devotion to the country that they live in than the people that are in the Senate or the House. They're all receiving so much cash from so many different donors and so many different sources of influence that the notion that there is a national interest is lost. So at this point, even Trump's assertions of what I want to do are meaningless because there's no path to get there. There's no readiness to follow it on the hill. So where are we headed, Glenn? I think we're headed right now nowhere. I think events will continue to happen to us. We will react. We will not initiate.
Well, what do you think? Because I agree, though. There's this interesting interview where Orban sits next to Trump, and he makes the point that the Europeans were initially very cautious in terms of going to war, or at least indirect war, now more direct against Russia. But he said Biden got them all riled up and ready to finally break the back of Russia. But now, of course, the Europeans are so deep into this that well, there's no reverse button. They just continue going on, even though the Americans are pulling back. Uh, but it does beg the question of where all this is going with Europe. Do you think the Europe could be heading towards collapse? Are they preparing for actual war with Russia, or is this posturing? Because while the rhetoric of the Europeans keep escalating, the Russians are also responding to this now. They not just anger. I mean, they can be angry and still have some objective view of what's the best approach. But beyond any anger, they also now increasingly see Europe as the main enemy. Europe, which essentially set Ukraine up for this, because again, if you go back to 2014. It was what 20% of Ukrainians who wanted to be a part of NATO. None of them wanted to fight against Russia. None of them wanted to cancel the the Russian language. And again, the whole war has been very much imposed to a large extent on the Ukrainians, and the Europeans are now seen as the main bad guy. So it looks like we're heading possibly somewhere quite dangerous, and it's not unlikely that the Russians will be more prepared now to retaliate, especially if they see the Americans having less enthusiasm for Europe.
Well, I don't think most Americans are even remotely connected to Europe from a purely national security standpoint. Most of them don't know anything about NATO. Most are not aware of the distribution of our armed forces all the way around the world. I mean, they know they're out there, but beyond that, they don't know much about it. The war machine that we built is largely gone rogue. It has continued to expand and increase itself without much consultation with the American people, and the American people haven't been engaged. So I think there are two sides to this. You have a lot of people in my generation and older who are horrified, who believe that if the Europeans are not somehow or another stabilized by our political, military, and economic influence, that they will fall out with each other and go back to war. Literally, there are people that believe that we have this long-term interest in helping Europe avoid that, and that we somehow or another have to herd the cats, as I said at the beginning. I don't share that view. I never have. I felt very strongly in the early 1990s, after we returned from the Gulf, that it was time for us to get out. This is going to sound like a cliche, but it's time to let the Europeans be Europeans. I think the Europeans have taken a very unhealthy approach, and that approach has been to emulate us, try to imitate our foolishness in so many ways. I don't think the massive migration that came out of North Africa and the Middle East that started in 2015 would have occurred if we were not in Europe. I think the Europeans would have defended their borders. I think they would have defended their countries, their culture, their civilization. And that's part of what I think Donald Trump was trying to say in this national security document. We have advertised ourselves as the model for everyone else. Just look at us. We're so fortunate. We have this wonderful economy. And oh, by the way, we have all these different people from all these different places, and we're all harmonious, love each other, and get along. Well, that's not true. Anybody who spends any time in the United States and really knows the place knows that we are very seriously divided along many lines: cultural, racial, ethnic, religious. So the notion that we're some sort of paradise where everyone magically leaves their unhappiness and baggage at the door, enters into the United States and lives in paradise is wrong. One of the biggest problems we have right now is there are 52 million people in the United States living here who were not born in the United States. Now, why is that a problem? Because they're not Americans. Now, how many of them came here to become Americans? It's hard to tell. We have perhaps 30 million or more so-called illegals. I think they may have come here to benefit from our largesse and free health care and housing and so forth if they can get it. I haven't seen much evidence that most of them are interested in being Americans. They don't even know what that means. So we're in a difficult position ourselves. And the bad news about this national security document is that it depicts Europe as something that is radically different from us, that is full of all these problems and difficulties and divisions, but we share them. We're in very much the same boat. That's the pathetic humor in all of this, tragically. We're in very much the same boat. And then the second piece that doesn't come up for discussion is the financial disaster. You know, the printing press has killed us. We've been printing fiat currency since 1973, almost nonstop. Got a problem, can't solve it, industry's at risk, print more money, more liquidity into the system, save the banks, keep it going. That's what we did in 2007 and 2008. And at the time, everybody said, wait a minute, if we don't allow failures, what Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, used to talk about as creative destruction, nothing will change. Well, gosh, Glenn, nothing changed. We just subsidized everything. Well, we're running up to this cliff now where we can't subsidize anymore. In fact, people think we've already gone over the cliff. But I see evidence that we're going to try and do that, and it will happen until we cannot. Does that mean the currency is debased? Probably. Are we going to end up like the Weimar Republic? There's a very high probability of that occurring right now. And then the question is, what do you do? If you cannot go to a gold standard or silver standard or some kind of standard, what do you do? Do you go into digital currency? Well, you're not going to get this digital currency we're inventing that means one coin equals $1. Who wants that? That's a waste of money. So Bitcoin is a very different animal that's going to become, I think, increasingly attracted to people. Will that work? I don't know. What I'm trying to say is that there are two parts to this. One is coming to terms with our own strategic reality as well as the European strategic reality. The second part of it is, what can we ultimately afford to do? And the truth is, not much. That's our problem. So it doesn't matter if you want 12 aircraft carrier battle groups. You may not be able to afford 6 or even 4 or 5. And do they make any sense in any case in this world today? I mean, these are the things that are absent from this national security document, but they affect all of us.
Well, the Ukraine war, though, besides having the objective of defeating Russia, it also had a key role in terms of reviving the role of NATO and keeping the United States in Europe. This is one of the reasons, I think, why the Europeans are so reluctant to put an end to this war and accept that, well, we lost it. But that's
But
what is.
we've been doing that since the 90s. Remember, the mantra in Washington, D.C. was either NATO is out of area or out of business. In other words, we have to run around and find things for our NATO European allies to do that serve American interests, or NATO is over. Then there was no willingness to let NATO go. The Europeans, not all of them, but large numbers of them, wanted to keep us in Europe. So they essentially prostituted themselves to us to keep us there. And at the same time, everything in Washington is mortgaged to vanity. Do we need to be in Europe? Didn't matter in 1995 whether we needed to be there or not. People wanted to stay. So they saw this as part of the larger global imperial structure that had emerged after the Second World War. I don't know how to fix this, except to point out that we're running out of money. We're not going to have the wherewithal. We can't afford it.
Well, what does this mean though? Because this view of Europe in the security strategy, this the view of the European leaders especially as being well, very undemocratic and by sidelining political opposition, media. Um, it's how much of this is Trump? Because I get the impression there's some growing contempt, if not for Europe, at least for the leaders. And did you see this as now? Do you interpret this as a signal of the U.S. Being willing to pull a bit away from NATO, or
I think that we would just as soon retire NATO as a structure. I think that's something that is in the back of President Trump's mind, has been for a long time. I mean, what is the rationale, the raison d'etre for NATO? And you've heard all these cute remarks about keep the Soviets out and the Germans down and all that nonsense. Now, having failed to make that case effectively, they start the war in Ukraine and try to say, oh, well, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. Well, if you haven't figured it out yet, the Russians are not coming. The Russians don't want to come. They have effectively gotten control of what is most important to them. They would like to consolidate this and bring the fighting to an end. And the Europeans in particular are saying, well, we want this to continue. Most of the people on the Hill are happy to let it continue in the United States. They see it as a moneymaker for them. What a catastrophe, but that's the way people look at it. That's why I was saying about the African warlord is more concerned about his people than the people in Washington are about us. So now I'm not saying that about President Trump per se. I think President Trump sees it differently. I think he sees it's time for Europe to be on its own. The Europeans have to come to terms with each other and with Russia. You know, we need to stop playing God in Europe. I think he feels that way, and I happen to agree with him. The same thing is true in Asia. Remember that wherever we go, we're the outsider. We interfere and we distort the dynamics that would otherwise shape the region. Our first major disaster was intervening during the First World War, and that was based purely on monetary interest. The bankers in London and New York City went to President Wilson and said, look, we're in a lot of trouble. The Germans are winning. If you don't intervene in this war, Germany and Austria-Hungary will win the war, and we'll be broke. So we have 318,000 casualties and 110 days of fighting to prevent Germany and Austria-Hungary from winning the war. Britain and France won the war. Communism was established in Russia because Russia fell apart. Great job. Brilliant job, President Wilson. What a wonderful outcome for Western civilization. And it's been downhill ever since. So I think a lot of us have felt, and I certainly did for a long time, it's time to leave. And let the Germans and the French and the Poles and everyone else, regardless of how difficult it may be, sort it out and figure out where they want to go and what they want to do. Now, I think if we get out of the way and our troops are removed, I think you'll have a much higher probability of seeing a clean sweep politically in Europe. Because, and we were talking about this before the show began, you said, well, the Europeans this, and I said, maybe they're globalist elites that are running the countries right now, but not the population. I do talk to Germans and Austrians pretty frequently, and I get a lot of information from the Poles and connections in Russia and Ukraine. People want this business over with. They're not interested in a war at all. It's the globalist elites that are in power. And you're sitting there and you're saying, how do you get rid of these people? Because the elections, the parliamentary procedures, everything seems to be rigged to prevent any fundamental change in the direction of the country. Well, if we get out of the way, I think that will change. Now, will that be violent or political? Will it be achieved at the ballot box? I don't know, Glenn. But the Europeans must regain control of their governments. They must rid themselves of the people who are at the top. If they don't do it, they will continue to sink into this abyss of poverty and despair, which is the road they're on right now.
Well, that's the main common denominator, though, of Starmer, Merz, and Macron is they're all immensely unpopular. They don't really focus much on domestic politics, spend most of the time, yeah, being obsessed about Ukraine and defeating Russia. So they don't have much support, of course, among their public. Uh,
Well, the Germans need to come to terms with an important reality. Here is this man, Matz, who used to work for BlackRock. BlackRock, Larry Fink, the former CEO, was in Kiev talking to his friend Zelensky about buying up and getting control of vast quantities of Ukrainian farmland, which Mr. Zelensky was only too happy to sell. And this is the background for Merz as prime minister or as chancellor of Germany. I mean, that's frightening. I mean, this person is fundamentally flawed and corrupt, in my judgment, based on his experience in that environment with people like Fink. I mean, everyone in Washington will tell you privately, if Larry Fink says it, don't believe it. I mean, now he's running the WEF, the World Economic Forum. Think about it. These people are poison. They have to be removed. The Europeans are going to have to do it. In this country, we're eventually going to have to do something similar. It's going to take us a little longer. We're a little bit behind you, but we're facing the same kind of problem.
Yeah, well, I think BlackRock Merz isn't really, yeah, representing the German popular will. But this is why I think a crisis could come to Germany, political crisis quite soon as well, much like in, of course, France and the UK. But given now that all of Trump's diplomatic effort seems to be falling apart, what does this mean for the war? What do you expect will happen over the coming weeks, if not months? Um, yeah, as you mentioned before, things aren't looking great on the battlefield. It is deteriorating further. Uh, if Irrespective of what Trump does at this point, is there anything that can stop the Russian advances now? Or I'm just
We're
trying to think what the Europeans are actually planning, because all they say is we can't accept this or that. Russia can't demand neutrality. It doesn't have a vote over NATO. It's just again, it's a lot of it's a big wish list, and but it doesn't really. I see no arguments, no strategy.
Well, I think you're right. I see this ending in a very direct way. It's back to the old comment that Napoleon Bonaparte was planning something with his generals and said, "Well, if you do that, the Pope won't like it." And he said, "How many battalions has the Pope?" I think that's the problem right now for the French, the British in particular, the Germans, also obviously the Poles. The Poles, the poor dears, they're sitting right there on the border with Russia, and they have the most to lose in any sort of conflict that would occur. I don't see much evidence that the majority of Polish citizens favor war with Russia. They certainly are not very friendly to the Ukrainians. They've got over 3 million living in their country that they'd like to send back. I guess my view is that Ukraine is going to end much like Vietnam did, not with a bang, but with a whimper. We started preparing to get out certainly no later than 1970. We were largely out of the fighting by 1972, early 73, and we left. And in 75, everything fell apart, and no one in Washington talked about it. And we stopped talking about it, and it went away. That's what we do. When things don't go our way, we fail strategically, we stop talking about it, and we go on to the next opportunity. I think that's what's going to happen in Ukraine. It's just going to fall apart. The Russians will advance. I think they're inevitably going to have to go into Kiev in some fashion. They will definitely go to Odessa. They've got more force concentrations up in the north now. Uh, They want to end this thing, but they know they can't just walk out. Although they'd like to walk out and go back to where they were in terms of the areas that they've annexed as part of Russia, but they know that's not possible. So they're going to press forward slowly, deliberately, and wait for things to change in Europe. They've already seen them change in the United States. So they've changed here. We don't want to be in a war with Russia. We've stated it categorically. President Trump wants to restore normalcy with Russia. He's got a Congress that doesn't. But the Congress has no skin in the game. That's our problem. They don't think they actually have to fight anybody. They don't think they'll be at risk or their country will. That's his problem. He has to deal with that. But the Europeans, I think they are going to witness change in their own countries, and that change will facilitate the final end of this mess. But I don't see how we, without the willingness to use military power directly in some fashion, have anything in the game anymore. We don't. In fact, we'd like to get back to business as usual with Russia. I think that's pretty clear.
There's some interesting contradictions though with the Europeans, because on one hand they make the point that they can't accept that the Crimea has returned to Russia, yet they recognize it's not so much they can do right now, but in the future it can be perhaps reversed. At the same time, they demand a peace agreement, which is offers a permanent, sustainable peace. But if you, in this permanent, sustainable peace, if you already make it clear that you're not happy with the status quo, and implying that this could be changed in the future with military force, they tend to signal very strongly to Moscow that this would be another Minsk, a temporary ceasefire until we could rebuild. But given that the US is seemingly charting a different path, what does this mean at the end of Ukraine, the Ukraine war? Sorry, is that also the end for NATO in your view?
Oh, absolutely. No question about it. NATO is disintegrating in front of us right now. If NATO were the alliance that we say it is and pretend that it is, then you could have made the decision back in 2022, 2023 to mobilize NATO. You could have summoned all the leadership to the NATO Council and said, we've decided the only way to deal with Russia is to confront Russia militarily. They otherwise will not take us seriously. But nobody wanted to fight. I mean, this is the problem. Anybody who looked at the situation in 2022 understood something right from the beginning. The Russians will fight. The Ukrainians will fight. Nobody else is going to fight. So, under the circumstances, the Europeans should say, we're not prepared to fight. If you're not prepared to fight, shut up and color. Do something else. Put an end to this. I think eventually that logic will win over the Europeans. But again, I see our presence, our influence inside Europe as essentially malicious because we prevent the Europeans from reaching their own conclusions. Because whenever an issue comes up, they turn around and look at us. Well, what do you say in Washington? What are you prepared to spend? What forces are you sending? What are the terms of trade that you're going to give us? How's this work with the EU? You can't just like that and worry about what are truly your own vital strategic interests. So we've got to get out. The problem has always been, how do you do it? And neither we nor the Europeans would take steps to facilitate it. There was always an opportunity to say, well, it's time now. The Soviet state is gone. Let's put in a European four-star. In other words, a senior European general to lead the NATO alliance. Well, nobody in Washington wanted that. They all wanted to be in charge. And we were going to lose general officer slots. Nobody in the Pentagon wants to do that. They want to be in charge of everything. And then they stand around and complain, well, the Europeans aren't spending enough. But if you turn around and say, well, we're going to lead and they're going to leave and they're going to have to, nobody wants that. This is a game. It's over. It's finished. The opportunity to plan this in a deliberate fashion that made strategic sense is over. It's not going to work that way. We're just going to leave. That's coming. Now, I can't say it's next week because we're going to have a fight here. Even though, for instance, because I worked on these things when I was in the Army staff, it's a lot less expensive to maintain your forces here at home and train them and equip them than it is to maintain them over in Europe or Korea or Japan. It is. It's less expensive. So that's actually a tremendous relief financially if you can train here. But nobody wants that. Everybody wants to be everywhere doing everything. Unless if you don't, then you lose overhead, you lose headquarters, you lose generals, you lose spending. Because if you go to Washington and you ask senators and congressmen, what is your job, Glenn? You know what they say? Our job is to spend money. So if we can't spend money, what do we do here? It's true. That's what they think. Well, they're about to reach that point where they're not going to be able to spend money. It's coming.
Well, I think you're right about I guess the danger of always, well, for eight decades, only looking towards the US for strategy, because there's a when you outsource strategic thinking for 8 decades, suddenly there's no more strategic thinking left. And to make matters worse, they also have the EU, which also essentially just makes the elected officials into bureaucrats who implement decisions which have been made already by some outsiders. So the strategic thinking is largely absent, which I think explains a lot of our current problems, of course.
Well, until recently, I always thought the Norwegians were the most sober-minded people in Europe because I remember asking a brigadier general, his name was Lundberg, up in Mons. He worked with me in Norwich, big, tall guy, great sense of humor. And we got into a discussion about the EU and the Eurozone and everything else. And I said, well, how do people feel about Brussels in Oslo? He said, well, the real question is, how does everyone in Bergen feel about the people in Oslo? And I said, what do you mean? He said, nobody in Bergen trusts the government in Oslo. Why would anybody in Oslo trust anybody in Brussels? Well, I thought that was a very healthy outlook. I wish Europeans would start thinking in those terms.
Well, not anymore. The the common sense is long gone, and now that the future with the Americans are a bit uncertain, the politicians are pushing very hard for connecting with the EU, so joining the sinking ship, and the resistance by the public is seen as something problematic. They don't appreciate, understand everything as well as the politicians, because the public vote with their feelings, and so even the question of whether or not it should be decided with a referendum can be possibly challenged, because well, again, this is the political elites who knows best, and of
Well,
course their friends in the media.
if you decide that the population is incapable of determining its own future, you're in a lot of trouble.
Well, so far that decision has not been made, but I expect over the next few weeks and months to see more and more sudden problems emerging, which we never knew existed, and then have all our politicians and journalists explain to us why the EU is the solution to all this problem. So, you can see where this is heading, but so far this is solid. I think two-thirds opposed to it. So we seem to be so far in the clear, but who knows? Anyways, Colonel, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Glenn. Good to see you again.
Likewise.